I have to say, I am moderately impressed because last week I told everyone that I was going to be preaching on evangelism again, and I expected only half of the crowd. But I do have to say we increased our attendance by one person. So that's pretty awesome. You didn't get scared of doing another sermon on evangelism. And that's a good thing, too, because we do need to talk more about it. Last week I talked about how evangelism is telling the good news. It's not simply about doing actions. We have to be out there sharing our faith and telling everyone about what God has done. But I said, oftentimes we like to kick the can of responsibility to someone else. But as Christians, we really can't do that. Each and every one of us is called to share the good news of Jesus Christ with others. But that can be a bit scary, and so I talked about how evangelism can be a community project where we work to do evangelism together and lessen the fear of sharing our faith with others. And so I went through all of that, but I really never talked about what the good news is. What is the good news? And of course, we know the good news is about Jesus Christ. But how do we take this news out into a world that has radically changed? Because we live in a world now that is, somewhat very apathetic, which means you don't really care, it doesn't really care, or it can be actually openly hostile towards the Christian faith. I don't know about you, but I remember 30, 35 years ago what our culture was like back in the 70s, 80s. That's when I grew up. Some of you are a little older and remember further back. But if you remember during those years, our culture actually pretty much embraced Christianity. In fact, it helped promote Christianity. If you watch television shows, sitcoms, stuff like that, they had basically Christian morals and themes that ran throughout them. Do you remember those days? Do you remember around Easter time? I do. I remember around Easter time because during Easter time, not only did the major networks carry the Ten Commandments, but how many of you remember that mini-series, Jesus of Nazareth? The one that started with Jesus' birth and went all the way through his death and resurrection. Did anybody remember that? Some of you do. The major networks were promoting the Christian message on television. And so we really didn't have to do evangelism. The culture kind of did our evangelism for us. Is that the same anymore? Not in the least. The culture is not helping the church at all when it comes to proclaiming the Christian message. If you want to find that Jesus of Nazareth miniseries, you better have cable, satellite, something like that, and then you got to dig for it in order to maybe find it around Easter. They'll still show the Ten Commandments, stuff like that, but as far as as far as sitcoms are concerned, do any of them really truly proclaim a Christian message? Not really. Not at all. And so we have to be the ones proclaiming the Christian message because the culture is not passing it down and surely not giving it to our kids. How so? Little illustration from camp. I went on one of the Bible studies with one of the church groups. I was with a bunch of 10-year-olds, and we were finishing up the Bible study, and it came time to pray the Lord's Prayer. And the camp counselor said, "Does everybody know the Lord's Prayer?" What do you think the expected answer would be at a church camp with 10-year-olds? Should be yes. One of the kids was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what the Lord's Prayer is." It's like, wow. So the way we did that is we prayed one little part of the Lord's Prayer, and then everybody prayed it so that this guy would be able to learn it. But can you imagine a kid who does not know the Lord's Prayer? Can you imagine what goes on in his head when he hears the word grace? Forgive us our trespasses. What in the world does hallowed mean? Can you imagine what is going on in this kid's head? He's got no clue. He's got no ability to even begin to relate to the Christian language and the stuff that we talk about when it comes to proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. And so given that this is the way the culture works and this is kind of the way things are nowadays, I wanted to maybe take some time to maybe work through how we could share the good news in a society where people really don't know or have very little understanding of the Christian faith. And I think one of the places we have to start is where we have some sort of common ground. Some place where we can definitely have a point of agreement. And as I think about this, I would think, one of the places where most people can agree is that the world is not quite right. Does anyone disagree with that statement? That the world isn't quite right? If you need some evidence that the world is not quite right, let me put some out there. We have poverty, right? People are hungry. There are some people who still do not have clean water to drink. There are people who do not have homes. There are people who hate one another, who intentionally harm one another. There are factions and divisions. There is warfare. There is theft and robbery. There is murder. There is adultery. There are people who are being used all the time. Do I need to continue to bring forth more evidence? The world's not right, is it? Now, how many of you would like to see it fixed? My God, we didn't have the whole congregation raise their hand. I have already lost you. Sermon done. Most of us would like to see it fixed. Most of us, and I think most people in the world agree on this, that the world is not quite right and we would like to see it fixed. But in order to fix the world, we need to be able to diagnose the problem. What's the problem? Now here is where I think we have to engage folks and let them begin to flesh things out. Because generally over history, it falls into two kinds of categories with people. And for the time being, we're going to set aside like natural disasters and disease and stuff. This is stuff that we can't control. I'll come back to that in just a little bit. We're going to focus on the human element. Because that's the problems that we usually try to address. Humanity and the things that humanity does against one another. So when you start looking at that, the way we have generally tried to address that over history is in one of two fashions. One of those fashions is to look at humanity and say that humans are basically evil. And that evil has to be kept in check. And one of the best ways we can keep evil in check is remove the problem folks out of society and put them away so that they no longer cause any issues. Familiar with this? It's like what our justice system is set up to do, man. You find somebody who's causing a problem, you go take them out of the public, you put them in jail, you leave them there until, they've paid their dues to society, and then maybe they'll learn their lesson and come back. But you remove as much of the evil out so that society can function. And the problem with this is generally, number one, when you remove one, does that solve the problem? How many of you remember the story of Hercules and the Hydra from ancient Greek mythology? Remember that one? Hercules goes after this mythical beast. You cut off one head, and how many head grew back? 2. You cut off one head, 2 grows back. A lot of times with criminals and stuff like that, you take one away, and then a couple more spring up. It's like it's a never-ending battle to try to remove the criminal element from society. So that becomes problematic because prison populations explode. They're overwhelmed. I mean, the U.S. has the greatest population of people in prison per capita of the rest of the world. So we're trying desperately to do this, and yet, is there still crime in our cities? People still getting shot? Bullying still happening? Yeah, it's not really working. The other part of that's a problem is, it labels people. And it oftentimes does not give people a chance for redemption. Do any of you know any convicted felons? Do you know how easy is it for them to get a job? How easy is it for them to try to rebuild their lives after screwing up? Are most people willing to even give them a chance, yes or no? So even though they may have gone through the process, even though they may have tried to rehab themselves, even though they may be out there trying to be good people, are they given a chance? They're not, and that's not exactly right. There's no place for redemption. There's no place for reconciliation. So in that avenue of trying to remove all the bad elements and stuff like that, there's quite a bit of shortfall. And it also doesn't account for the good things that people do. I mean, if people are basically evil, then why do you have people sacrificing themselves for one another? Why do you have people who go out of their way to be kind? Why do you have people who go out of their way to be generous? If humanity is basically evil, why do all of these things happen? So it falls short of kind of explaining what the problem is. So on the other hand, the other direction that folks have gone is to say that people are basically good. That we're born basically kind and good and what have you, and that the problem comes with how we're raised, how we interact with society. When we bump up against the societal structures and stuff like that, something goes wrong that leads us down the right path. So if someone steals in school, we don't necessarily blame the kid, but we start looking at how they were raised, we look at their parenting, we look at maybe how they were taught in what organizations they belong to, what socioeconomic group they belong to, and we say, okay, it's not the kid's fault, it's society's fault. You familiar with this line of thinking too? How far does that take us? It doesn't, because the thought then becomes, if people are basically good, then we have to construct a society. We have to put all the right laws in place that will allow people to thrive. And if we just get all the structures right, if we just get our education right, if we just get our society right, if we just get our laws right, people will be good. Now, there's a couple of problems with this too. And the first one is, who gets to decide what the society looks like? Who gets to decide what the rules are? Who gets to decide when you have enough goods and they need to be redistributed? Who gets to call the shots? Is it the government? Is it the will of the democracy and the people? Is it the poorest of the poor? Is it the powerful? Who gets to call the shots and make all those rules up? Who gets to build the society? And if you look at history, and you think about those groups that I just named, have any of those who call the shots ever turned out well? Yes or no? They haven't. So it's like, who gets to call the shots? Who gets to construct the society? And then, here's the other kicker on that one. Even when you construct a society, even when you put it together, is it going to eradicate these things? We as humans have been around this earth for like 10,000 plus years, right? And out of that, we've kind of had civilization really kind of develop in the last like 3,000-4,000 years. So even though in the sense of time frame with how long the earth has been here, we've been around for quite a while. And we've tried just about every single type of societal structure with just about every single type of societal rules. Have we managed to get rid of evil? Have we managed to get rid of poverty, hunger, stealing, killing, warfare? Have we? You would think by now we might have come close. But we haven't, because that doesn't work. It hasn't fully diagnosed the problem. And I think at this point, that's when we as Christians step in and say, well, you know what? We Christians have a different take on things. We don't think that we have dug deep enough to figure out what the real problem is. Because we as Christians don't see people as either totally evil or totally good. We believe that people were created good. I mean, if you read through Genesis chapter 1 and you go through what God does in creation, I mean, just about every day he stands back and says, this is good, this is good. At day 6, he looks back at everything that he has made, including us as humans, and he says that it's very good. And so we were created good, but then something happened. Something happened to change that, corrupt it. There were a couple of very particular humans that God had a special relationship with. And he put them in a garden. And they had the opportunity to live and walk with God or go their own way. And they decided to what? They decided to go their own way. They decided they wanted to be like God. They decided they could know good and evil without God. They thought they could be their own little gods. And literally all hell broke loose. And what we as Christians say is that, when humanity decided to separate itself from God and go its own way, the power of sin was released into the world. And we have to be able to say that sin is not just the things that we do. The Bible also says that sin is a power that is moving and living and active in the world. And it corrupts everything that it touches. And so not only does it corrupt us as human beings, it corrupts the creation. Do you think God created the oceans with the intent that they would flood the land and destroy the land and people's homes and stuff? Do you think God intended that to happen? No, sin corrupted it. Do you think God intended volcanoes to erupt, mountains to blow up, and destroy people and villages and property? Do you think God intended that? No, it was the power of sin that corrupted it and moved in the world. Do you think God intended disease to come upon us, cancer to kill us, malaria to be spread to people, encephalitis to kill people's brains? Do you think God intended that? No, it's the power of sin that has corrupted all of these things in nature and has corrupted us. When the man and woman in the garden decided to go their own way, they turned in on themselves. They started looking out for their own self-interest, their own understandings, their own way of doing things. And when we look to ourselves rather than look out to God, bad things truly happen. The power of sin corrupts. Now at this point we need to say, okay, well, what can we do about that? How can we deal with the power of sin? How can we deal with this turning in on ourselves and instead work towards goodness? And I've heard several different ways of this, and folks have engaged in this, and I think, as we talk about this with others, a lot of times they'll bring forth arguments. They'll say, okay, well, in order to deal with this, let's appeal to people's self-interest. Isn't it in our self-interest to be peaceful? Isn't it in our self-interest to be kind? Do you really want to live in a world where people are hating one another all the time? So it's better for society if everyone were kind towards one another. It's better for society if we didn't have war. It's better for society if, things work smoothly and we have peaceful resolutions to conflict. So it's in our own self-interest for things to be good. Agree or disagree? What's the problem with this? Is it always good to work towards your own self-interest? So if you set this up to say we work towards our own self-interest and being good is our own self-interest, I'm not sure it's going to completely solve the problem. Because of this, let's say that one day you skipped a few meals. You're really, really hungry. And you reach in your pocket, you got enough to go eat at Whataburger. One meal. And you're walking up to Whataburger, and outside you see someone who is homeless and they are obviously hungry. What should you do? And what are you going to do? Because, if it's in my self-interest, we human beings are actually rational, logical creatures. And we're going to think, okay, if it's in my self-interest to be good, what should I do here? If I go in there and buy a meal and I split it in half, he'll be less hungry, I'll be less hungry, but I won't be full, I won't be satisfied, and we'll just be less hungry. But if I go in there and I eat that meal myself, I will be full. And this guy still won't have a job or anything else like that, and he's just going to be hungry tomorrow. So is it better for me? Is it in my self-interest to help this person out, or is it in my self-interest to eat? Which is it? Which is going to win just about every single time? Ourselves. I'm going to take care of myself first. When you appeal to self-interest, self will always take precedent. And if I see that it's in my self-interest to not be good, to not be kind, that I'm going to get further ahead by breaking the rules, by going in another direction, what am I going to do? I'm going to head off in the other direction. So appealing to self-interest, while it might work a little bit, overall it's not a solution. It's not going to happen. So the other way to maybe combat this sin problem is to use fear. Fear works to an extent, but it's not 100% effective. I'm glad Jack's here today, because maybe Jack has had this happen to him, because I've seen it happen on the highway many times. Jack, have you ever been driving down the highway and the speed limit is like 75, but you're driving 70 miles an hour? And then what happens to the traffic behind you? They stay back there. That's right. Why? Because they're terrified. They're afraid that Jack's going to turn on his flashing lights and sirens and get them, man, even if they're driving the speed limit. But as soon as Jack pulls off the highway and starts heading down the country road, what do people on the highway do? They go 90, man. I mean, they do 90. I mean, they take off like a bullet because the threat is gone, man. Fear is removed, and so now I can just do what I want. And I mean, that's just the way we humans oftentimes operate. You know, I'm going to tell one of my son, man. I mean, this came home big time this past week. He's off in children's church right now, so I don't want to embarrass him too much. We were sitting at the table eating lunch with some of the other counselors and stuff like that. We were talking, and we got into talking about how sometimes, you know, people get out of line and this, that, and the other. And my son was talking about, you know, pushing the boundaries and stuff like that. And I turned to him and I said, boy, you know that there have been times when you got yourself a whooping for getting out of line. And he looked right back up at me and said, only with the stuff you know about. I don't know where he got his smart mouth. I really don't. But it's true. It's true. It's like, you know, if the threat of punishment is not there, and it's a way, and you can get away with it, a lot of times you're going to. And I mean, if justice is not swift, fair, and equal all the way across the board, putting in laws that govern by fear don't work. They don't work at all. And so you can't appeal to self-interest. You can't appeal to the fear of the law to break us out of this turning in on ourselves. This power of sin will continue to have its hold on us. And so the answer to what breaks the power of sin, the answer of what turns us away from ourselves, it's a word that we all know, and it's absolutely true. It's love. And everybody agrees on that. Everybody agrees, I think, that if we just love one another, if we just cared for one another, that the world would be a better place. If we could turn and just love one another, we would no longer just look to ourselves, and we would no longer be in our self-interest. But here's the problem. Can you make someone love someone else? You just can't. You can't legalize love. You can tell someone, love your enemies. Is that going to make them do it? You can tell someone, love your neighbor. Is it going to make them do it? I mean, as the great George Strait once sang, you can't make a heart love somebody. You can lead a heart to love, but you can't make it fall. You can't legislate and legalize love. You can't make love happen. That's got to happen in another way. So the question is, how do you inspire love? When I was about 10 to 12 years old, I remember that my parents got a phone call one day from my grandfather. And my grandfather asked them to bring me to the house. And we were traveling to the house, and one of the things you need to understand about my grandfather, he was an old German World War II vet, stubborn, hard-headed, like you wouldn't believe it was his way or the highway. I don't know how I'm related to him. Yeah, I've just described most of the community. But he smoked. He drank, just about every day. And when he got into his, modes of stubbornness, you really couldn't break him out of it. And he was really stubborn about certain things. And I remember that there were times where, we'd have parties at the house, birthday parties and other things, and oftentimes we'd invite, big crowds to come. And my grandpa stopped coming. And the reason he stopped coming is that one time we were having this party, and several people were allergic to cigarette smoke. And my folks asked him, would you please not smoke, while these folks are here? And his response was, well, if they're more important than me, I just won't come. Serious. The first time he did that, he was staying at home and he got on his tractor and he was plowing the turning rows, disking the turning rows, and his tractor broke down like a mile away from the house and he had to walk all the way back. I was like, I don't believe in karma, but that was kind of funny. He got what he deserved. I mean, just stubborn in that manner. And so, there were times where I really didn't like my grandpa. On this day, he asked us to come over and we went. And he took me out to one of his sheds. And he opened the door. And there in the door was a brand spanking new self-propelled lawnmower. It's when they just started having self-propelled mowers coming out and stuff. And he said, Kevin, this is yours. See, my grandfather knew that my dad was making me mow the lawn and everything else at our house, and we had a full acre of land. About half of it was lawn, and I had to mow that with just a standard push mower. And my grandfather had felt sorry for me having to mow all of that, and so he bought this mower for me. And I mean, for some people, lawnmower stuff. I was just elated. I was so happy. And my grandfather was one of those stoic Germans that rarely, if ever, said that he loved anyone. And I was just so thankful, and we were walking back towards the house together. We were walking arm in arm. Probably the only time he and I ever did that. And his kidneys had begun to fail. He was on medication. He was weak. He was literally being supported by me. And as we were walking, and I was just thanking him profusely. And he said, Kevin, I love you. And at that moment, I would have charged the fires of hell with a bucket of ice water if that old man had asked me to do it. And I don't know if you have ever had an experience like that in your life, but if you have, you understand just a little bit about what the grace of God is like. Because if we can agree that this world ain't right, and if we can agree that we're part of that world and we're not quite right either, we can also agree that we don't follow the laws of society, neither do we follow the laws of God as we should. And if we can agree that we don't follow the laws of God as we should, and we agree that God is a God of justice, we agree that we deserve punishment for our failure to follow those laws. And if God is the God of justice, who He is, that means we would be separated from God as our punishment. But instead of having that separation, Jesus comes in and Jesus stands in front of our Heavenly Father and says, they should be condemned. They should be found guilty for breaking those laws. But instead of condemning them and punishing them, punish me. I'll take the punishment for them. Consider them innocent. Consider me guilty. I will die in their stead. And some folks may say, well, shouldn't the guilty serve their own time? Shouldn't the guilty be charged and suffer their own punishment? And in one way, yes. But if you're a parent, man, and you know your kids get into trouble, and you know your kids do stuff that they should be punished for, how many times do we as parents step in and fix what our kids break? How many times when they break stuff around the house have we gone to the store and replaced what they broke, giving them maybe a stern warning or something like that? But how many times do we pay the cost for their transgressions? How many times do we go up to school and plead their case before the principals, before others, because they can't do it themselves? How many times do we step in to save our kids because we desperately love them? And that's what Jesus does for us. He steps in, He pleads our case, He takes and pays the punishment for our transgressions, and then He turns around and says, you now have my place. You now have life with God. You now are blameless, spotless, sinless. You're now justified. When I think about that, and when I think about what Jesus has done by putting Himself to face my sin, I'm ready to charge the fires of hell with a bucket of cold water for Him, because He was willing to die for me. It's sheer grace. It's sheer grace, and my heart begins to overflow with love for Jesus Christ. My heart begins to overflow with love of God, who was willing to give His Son for me so that I did not face that punishment. My heart begins to overflow with gratitude, with joy, with peace. It changes me and begins to break me out of looking at myself and begins to help me look at Jesus. And when Jesus looks at me and says, feed the hungry, how can I help? When Jesus says, love your neighbor, gladly. When Jesus says, love your enemy, I'll do my best because I love you. And I love what you have done for me. And as that love begins to be shared, as the story of what Jesus has been told, has done, begins to be told into the world, it's not my heart that changes. It's also the world's heart that changes, because Jesus didn't just die for Kevin Howe. Who did Jesus die for? He died for you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. He died for the world. And when the world's heart is changed, when people's hearts change, when they begin reaching out, wars cease, poverty disappears, the hungry are fed, the thirsty are given drink, the sick are visited, the prisoners are rehabilitated and freed. The world is changed. It's been changed before. It can be changed again when we tell the good news, when we do evangelism. That's one of the reasons we're here.